If you had told me 2 years ago that someone would build a fully furnished guest house on my land, then drag me into court after I tore it down, I probably would have laughed and asked how much you'd had to drink. But that's exactly what happened. And somehow the craziest part wasn't even the lawsuit. It was discovering why that little house had really been built in the first place. My name is Ethan Brooks. I'm 53 years old, and I've lived just outside Harbor Point, Wisconsin, for most of my adult life. Back in 1988, before the neighborhood had fancy entrance signs, monthly dues, or people arguing over mailbox colors, I bought a quiet piece of lakefront property because I wanted exactly one thing: peace. I had spent nearly 30 years as a mechanical engineer solving other people's problems, so when I finally started slowing down, I dreamed about mornings with coffee on the dock, evenings watching the sun disappear over the water, and weekends where the loudest noise I'd hear would be loons calling across the lake. That place became more than property to me. I planted every maple tree along the driveway myself. I built the wooden dock with my father before arthritis made it impossible for him to swing a hammer. Every scratch on the old storage shed had a story behind it, and every inch of that backyard reminded me of someone I loved. Then, around 2004, everything started changing. Developers bought empty lots. Expensive homes started popping up, and before long, the neighborhood announced it was creating a homeowners association. Most people signed without thinking twice. I didn't. My deed had been recorded years before the HOA even existed, and after speaking with an attorney at the time, I learned I wasn't legally obligated to join. I wished everyone well, told them I had no interest in causing problems, and figured we'd all leave each other alone. For years, that's exactly how it worked. I'd wave at neighbors while mowing the lawn, help pull boats out before winter, and keep to myself. I wasn't anti-HOA. I just wasn't part of it. That little detail mattered a whole lot more than I realized. Everything changed after Melissa Carter became HOA president. Melissa had a way of smiling that somehow felt like she was already disagreeing with you. She loved talking about community vision and shared responsibility. But if you listen carefully, what she really meant was that everyone should see things exactly the way she did. Standing beside her at nearly every board meeting was Trevor Mills, the HOA's property manager, a guy who nodded before Melissa even finished her sentences. They weren't openly hostile toward me, at least not in the beginning. It was more subtle than that. I'd hear little comments during neighborhood gatherings. Too bad everyone isn't contributing. Or, some people enjoy the amenities without supporting the community. Funny thing was, I never used any HOA amenities because they didn't belong to me, and I preferred keeping it that way. I thought the passive-aggressive remarks were as bad as it would ever get. Then one afternoon in early spring, an envelope showed up in my mailbox with the HOA logo printed across the corner. It was labeled as a courtesy notice. That phrase still makes me laugh. According to the letter, the board had unanimously approved construction of a new community guest cottage overlooking the lake so visiting families could stay close during neighborhood events. Honestly, my first reaction was, good for them. I tossed the letter onto my kitchen counter, poured another cup of coffee, and forgot about it. It wasn't until later that evening, while absent-mindedly looking over the construction sketch included with the notice, that something caught my eye. The outline looked familiar. Too familiar. I walked into my office, opened the metal filing cabinet where I'd kept decades of property records, and pulled out my most recent survey. I spread both papers across the dining room table and lined up the shoreline, then the tree line, then the old drainage easement near the back corner. My stomach tightened almost immediately. I checked again because surely I had to be missing something. I even grabbed a ruler like somehow measuring paper would change reality. It didn't. According to the HOA's own drawing, their so-called community property wasn't community property at all. It was my backyard. I remember standing there in complete silence, staring through the window toward the lake where the evening sunlight reflected off the water, trying to convince myself it had to be some drafting mistake. Nobody could seriously plan to build an entire house 12 feet inside someone else's property line. Could they? I decided to give them every opportunity to fix what I assumed was an honest error. Looking back now, that was probably the last truly peaceful night I had before the next 16 months turned into the strangest chapter of my entire life. The next morning, I sent the first email. Nothing dramatic, nothing threatening, just a polite message explaining that I believed the construction map accidentally included a portion of my property and attaching a copy of my certified land survey. I figured somebody would reply with an apology, maybe blame a drafting company, and we'd all move on with our lives. Instead, silence. 3 days passed without a single response, so I sent another email, then left a voicemail for the HOA office. Then another one for Melissa Carter. Late Friday afternoon, my phone finally rang. "Mr. Brooks," Melissa said in the same pleasant voice people use right before they tell you something ridiculous. "Our records indicate the land in question is part of the common lakefront area." I looked out my kitchen window toward the exact stretch of grass she was talking about and honestly thought she had to be reading somebody else's file. "Melissa," I replied, trying hard to stay calm. "I've owned that property since Ronald Reagan was president. I've got surveys, tax records, county filings. What records are you looking at?" She paused for just a second before saying, "Those are the records the board has approved." That sentence stuck with me because she didn't say they were correct. She said they were approved. Those are two very different things. I mailed another packet anyway, this time by certified mail with copies of my deed, the 2021 survey, photographs of the property markers, and a short letter asking them to suspend construction until the county could verify the boundary. I even highlighted the parcel numbers to make everything easier. According to the tracking receipt, someone at the HOA office signed for it 48 hours later. No one ever answered. About 2 weeks after that, I woke up to the sound of heavy diesel engines. Through the bedroom window, I saw 2 pickup trucks, an excavator, and a trailer parked along the edge of my property. I threw on my boots and walked outside while one of the workers was unloading equipment. "Morning," I said. "Can I ask what you're doing?" The foreman smiled politely and pointed toward a stack of rolled blueprints. "Building the community guest cottage." I nodded. "You're standing on private property." He looked confused, glanced toward the plans, then back at me. "Sir, we've got permits." "You may have permits," I answered, "but permits don't change property lines." He didn't argue. In fact, he seemed uncomfortable. He called someone from the site superintendent's truck, spoke quietly for a couple of minutes, then came back and said, "We've been instructed to continue unless the HOA tells us otherwise." I immediately called Melissa again, straight to voicemail. Trevor answered on the second attempt. "Construction has already been authorized," he said flatly. "If you have concerns, submit them in writing." I couldn't help laughing. "I've submitted 3 of them. Then I'm sure someone will review them." Click. That was the entire conversation. From that point forward, I started documenting absolutely everything. Every truck that entered the property, every worker, every delivery, every conversation. I installed additional security cameras facing the construction area and backed up the footage every evening onto 2 separate hard drives. My neighbor across the road, Frank, wandered over one afternoon carrying a lawn chair and a cooler. Frank was retired Army, the kind of man who rarely spoke unless he had something worth saying. He sat beside me while we watched framing crews raising walls that absolutely did not belong there. After about 20 minutes, he quietly asked, "You gonna stop them?" I looked toward the skeleton of what would soon become a house and shook my head. "Not today." He raised one eyebrow. "That doesn't sound like you. My attorney says if I physically interfere before they've completed the trespass, they may try painting me as the aggressor." Frank took a slow sip from his soda. "So you're letting them dig a deeper hole?" "Exactly," he chuckled. "Well, that's either the smartest thing you've ever done or the dumbest." Over the next several months, the structure kept growing. Concrete became walls. Walls became a roof. Electricians arrived. Plumbers followed. Landscapers planted shrubs that I'd never asked for. Every time I drove home from town, there it was, sitting in my backyard like some unwanted guest who had decided to unpack. Friends couldn't believe it. My sister called after seeing pictures I'd texted her. "Ethan," she said, "why aren't the police doing something?" I wish it worked that way. Property disputes almost never get solved in a single afternoon. Civil law moves slowly, especially when organizations insist they're acting in good faith. My attorney, Daniel Harper, explained it over coffee one morning. "They're betting you'll get frustrated enough to settle," he said, "or that you'll panic and make a mistake." Daniel wasn't flashy. He didn't make dramatic speeches. He simply collected facts. Every email, every receipt, every photograph, every unanswered certified letter. He kept repeating the same sentence. Documentation beats emotion every single time. So I waited, even though every instinct told me to drive a bulldozer straight through that framing. Waiting turned out to be harder than fighting. There were nights I'd stand on my deck staring at lights glowing inside that building. wondering how people could walk across my grass and never once question whether they belonged there. By the summer of the following year, the guest cottage was finished. 850 square feet, 2 bedrooms, full bathroom, modern kitchen, covered deck overlooking the lake, fresh cedar siding, stone walkway. If someone had built it legally, I probably would have admitted it looked beautiful. Instead, it felt like somebody had parked an expensive reminder of arrogance in the middle of my life. That's when Daniel suggested something I hadn't considered. "Let's survey it one more time," he said. "Not because we need proof for ourselves, because we need proof no reasonable person can argue with." We hired an independent licensed surveyor who had no connection to the county or the HOA. He spent nearly an entire day locating original iron monuments buried decades earlier beneath the soil. I followed him around carrying bottled water while his GPS equipment beeped and flashed across the yard. When he finished, he looked at me, folded his notebook shut, and simply said, "Mr. Brooks." "I missed by 12 feet. 12 inches?" I asked. He shook his head. "Feet." Even after hearing it aloud, I almost couldn't believe anyone could make a mistake that large, especially after being warned repeatedly. Daniel spread the survey, my deed, and the construction photos across his conference table the following morning. He leaned back in his chair, removed his glasses, and smiled for the first time since I'd hired him. "Congratulations," he said. "You're about to become the legal owner of the world's most expensive unauthorized guest house." I laughed harder than I had in months. Then he slid one final letter across the table. "Send this to them. Give them 72 hours to remove their building from your land." I signed it without changing a single word. Melissa received it by email before lunch and by certified mail the following morning. Her response came within hours, accusing me of intimidation, vandalism, and threatening community assets if I touched the structure. Daniel read her email, grinned, and forwarded back exactly one attachment: a formal legal opinion confirming the house stood entirely on my property and that I possessed every legal right available to a landowner. They ignored that one too. 72 hours came and went without so much as a phone call, and before sunrise on the 4th morning, as I stood holding a cup of coffee in the cool Wisconsin air, I heard the unmistakable rumble of diesel engines rolling slowly down my driveway. I set my coffee down on the hood of my old pickup and watched 3 demolition trucks pull onto the property just as the first light was breaking over the lake. The crew climbed out like they'd done this 1,000 times before, calm, professional, almost boring, which somehow made the moment feel even more surreal. 10 minutes later, Melissa came flying down the road in her SUV with Trevor right behind her. Before either vehicle had fully stopped, she jumped out pointing at the excavator and screaming, "If you touch that building, you're committing felony vandalism." The demolition foreman didn't even answer her. He looked at me instead. I handed him Daniel's legal opinion, the certified survey, and the 72-hour notice. He flipped through the paperwork, nodded once, and quietly told his crew, "Proceed." Melissa turned toward me, absolutely furious. "You'll be paying for every single nail in that house." I looked her straight in the eye and said, "No, Melissa, I already paid for the land underneath every single nail." The excavator eased forward, its hydraulic arm rose into the air, and with one clean swing it punched through the roof. For 16 months I'd watched strangers build that cottage one board at a time. Now, in less than 6 hours, every wall, every window, every cabinet, and every shingle disappeared into neatly organized debris piles. By early afternoon, the concrete foundation had been broken apart. The hole was filled, fresh topsoil had been spread, and grass seed covered the ground. If someone drove by a week later, they would have never guessed a house had ever stood there. Melissa kept her promise about one thing. 4 days later, the HOA sued me for $65,000, claiming I had intentionally destroyed valuable community property. Daniel didn't seem worried in the slightest. In fact, he smiled while reading the complaint and immediately filed a countersuit alleging trespassing, unauthorized construction, unjust enrichment, and unlawful occupation of private property. Then everything changed because someone I'd never met called me from a block number. He introduced himself only as a subcontractor who had worked on the guest cottage and said he couldn't stand watching innocent homeowners being lied to anymore. We met at a diner 30 miles away. He slid a plain envelope across the table without saying much. Inside were copies of HOA meeting minutes, internal emails, and payment approvals that should never have left the boardroom. Sitting there in that booth, I realized the guest cottage had never been intended for visiting families at all. It had been Melissa and Trevor's private weekend getaway from the beginning. Only 7 people had ever been given the door code, and not one of them was an ordinary homeowner. The HOA had approved $65,000 of community money to build themselves a lakeside retreat on land they didn't even own. It almost sounded too unbelievable to be true until Daniel verified every document. We obtained additional financial records during discovery, and they matched perfectly. I still remember sitting at my dining room table looking through photographs I'd taken over the previous year. There were wine bottles on the kitchen counter, suitcases beside the bedroom closet, paperback novels about beach vacations, even framed family photos that certainly didn't belong in temporary guest accommodations. Melissa's explanation that the building existed only for board meetings collapsed almost overnight. I mailed copies of the meeting minutes to every homeowner in the association, uploaded the documents to the neighborhood Facebook page, and within 24 hours local reporters were calling my phone. Suddenly, the story wasn't about a man tearing down a house. It was about HOA leaders secretly using homeowners' money to build themselves a vacation cottage on private property. Public opinion turned faster than I ever imagined. 2 weeks later, Melissa resigned. Trevor was fired before the month ended. The HOA quietly withdrew its lawsuit, hoping everyone would simply move on. But Daniel wasn't interested in letting them walk away that easily. "They occupied your land for 16 months, he reminded me. "Rent isn't free just because the tenant was arrogant." Negotiations lasted several weeks before both sides finally reached a settlement. The HOA agreed to pay me $1,800 every month for the next 3 years, plus $28,800 in retroactive compensation for the months they had unlawfully occupied my property, bringing the total value of the agreement to $93,600. Daniel insisted on adding one final clause that might be my favorite sentence in any legal document I've ever signed. If the HOA missed one payment, the monthly amount automatically doubled. If they missed 2, I could immediately place a lien against HOA funds. Their attorney hated that clause. Daniel wouldn't remove it. In the end, they signed anyway. So far, every payment has arrived exactly on time, almost like they've suddenly become very interested in respecting property rights. These days, when I sit on my dock watching the sunset, the view looks exactly the way it did before all of this started. And maybe that's the biggest victory of all. It was never really about the money or even the guest house. It was about refusing to let people with titles convince everyone else that rules only apply when they're convenient. I'd rather spend my evenings fishing than talking to lawyers. But sometimes peace has to be defended before you get to enjoy it again. Now I'm curious what you think. If your HOA had built a house on your land after you warned them over and over again, would you have handled it the same way? Or would you have done something completely different? Let me know down in the comments, because I honestly think this is one of those stories where reasonable people can disagree. And if you enjoyed this one, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who's ever had to deal with neighbors who thought they owned a little more than they actually did.